Hello, and welcome to the Educator's Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world. Conversations where we stay curious for a little bit longer about the issues, challenges, and opportunities we are facing in our schools and in our communities. So, whether you're walking, running, cooking, or just relaxing, I hope that you're ready for a compelling conversation with today's guest, Matthew Savage. Now, Matthew does a huge amount of work on well-being with a range of schools across the world. And so I thought we might start today's podcast with a little poem, which to me says one or two things about well-being in schools. It might ground us and get us into that place if we need some help with that. So this is called Polar Bear by Steve Camden. Here we go. All together, same place, same walls, same space. Every emotion under the sun, faith lost, victories won. It doesn't stop until the bell. Now it's heaven. Now it's hell. Who knows? Not me. I just wrote what I can see. So what's it about? Here's my response. It's about everything, all at once. Today's guest is Matthew Savage, architect of what he calls the Mona Lisa effect, and formerly an international school principal himself. Matthew is now an educational consultant working with a number of the world's best international schools. And here at BSM, we are proud to count ourselves at one of his clients. Matthew's work focuses on ensuring we always put well-being first, in order that every child, without condition or exception, can be seen, be heard, be known, belong. Welcome to the show, Matthew. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us from the Isle of Skye in Scotland. How is your week shaping up?
Well, firstly, thank you, Kai, for having me, and thanks for introducing the podcast with that poem. I think it was a powerful piece that strikes me on a number of levels, actually. This idea of school being overwhelming, not just at this time of year, but all of the year for some members of our community, is something I come across in my work a lot. Kids and adults who are struggling with their mental health, kids and adults who identify as neurodivergent. The school experience can be like everything all at once the entire time, right? And so it's so important for that reason, among so many others, that we do put that well-being first. But it also struck me, and we'll come on to this later, I think, about how everything is about everything all at once, right? As soon as we start dealing with things in silo or separately from other things, that's when we hit the real problem. So thanks for the poem, and thanks for having me. My week so far, I've just got back from the Côte d'Azur, where I was giving a graduation speech to the grade 12 graduating class from the International School of Nice. So that was very pleasant to have some sunshine, which we don't get much of up here. And other than that, this is my seeding time of year, where generally I'm putting down the seeds for the work that I'll do with my clients next year. So it's a reflective time of year, and generally a quiet one.
Fantastic. And thank you for your response to the poem there. And it'd be interesting, listeners out there, if you have a response to that poem that you'd like to share, then please share that in the comments on the LinkedIn post below. You talk about seeding time. I'm curious, Matthew, about, is it the right weather at the moment on the Isle of Skye for seeding? Because I know you can have some fairly long and bitter winters up in that part of the world.
To be honest, it's 4 seasons in one day here. So it's very hard to distinguish a lot of the time. Last Saturday it was really warm and sunny. Later on this week, some snow is expected on the hills. From the window behind this screen, I see strong winds, rainbows, bright sunshine, horizontal rain most days, to be honest with you. So the weather is changeable, but always dramatic and always beautiful.
Brilliant. Sounds like a very wonderful place to live in that part of the world. I mean, just for your information, it is incredibly hot and humid in Oman. And I wouldn't say the weather's anywhere near as changeable as in Skye. I mean, it tends to be hot or very hot. and we're certainly one of those very hot periods at the moment. Okay, well, let's just jump straight in, Matthew, and let's start exploring and sharing some thoughts about the work that you do with schools. And let's do I guess, the Simon Sinek piece. What's the purpose of the work that you do with schools? What's your why for all this wonderful work that you are doing around the world with different schools?
Well, my purpose, the purpose of my work is, as you described at the beginning of this episode, that I try to ensure every child can, without exceptional condition, be seen, heard, known, and belong. But every child can do that for who they actually are beneath the manifold masks that they wear. So my work is about masks, exploring the form and function of those masks and enabling the authentic self beneath to belong. But my own why in my professional work, I guess it's about stories. My why is that I want to share and listen to stories. The anthropologist Nora Bateson, who loved coining words, she created a word, phanopoesis. It comes from Greek stems, but in her coinage, it means what happens in that liminal space that grows when I share stories with you and you share stories with me. And in that liminal space, something beautiful will sprout. And so my why is about story sharing and storytelling and encouraging others to do the same.
Okay, so let's maybe just explore that a little bit further, Matthew. I mean, I'm curious as to maybe maybe you could tell us briefly your story of your work with the Mona Lisa effect. How did that start? If you're making an origin story and you're doing a trailer, what might the origin story in a nutshell look like if you were sharing that with the world?
The Mona Lisa origin for me takes me back to my honeymoon back in 1997. My wife and I were in the salle de passe in the Denon wing of the Louvre, and we were looking at Lisa Gherardini in her tiny frame on the wall of that room. And I had always been struck when I'd seen her in books by her magic eyes, the fact that they were looking at everybody all at once. And so I remember wanting to test this theory out and to see if I moved around the room, whether or not her eyes were moving with me. And one of the many powers of that picture is when I share it digitally with audiences around the world, even the digital reproduction of those eyes looks everywhere. And it struck me as I began my teaching career that that's essentially what we wanted metaphorically within our classroom. We wanted a classroom whereby every kid felt that the learning and well-being experience of that classroom, of that school, was looking at them for who they really were, hence that Mona Lisa effect.
That is a really interesting start to that work. Very beautiful start to that work, may I say. So listeners who have not heard of the Mona Lisa effect, Matthew, can you explain what it is and how it works?
Absolutely. It's exploring an epistemological journey, really. It's trying to seek answers to what I regard to be the two most essential questions in our work as school leaders, which is firstly, who are you? We need to be able to answer that question about each of the children and young people and the adults in our school. And secondly, as a result of aggregating and assimilating those stories, who are we? So the Mona Lisa effect seeks answers to those two questions and then goes further by asking us, how do we know? That's the epistemology of it, right? And what do we do next? So the work I do, the Mona Lisa effect, it explores what I call the intersection between well-being and DEIJB, or diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging. But I do it through the prism of 4 different kinds of data. And I think we'll come on to those later: kind, warm, street, and slow. So it's through using data to understand stories, to answer those two essential questions, to inform systemic change.
Okay, and that is quite, I guess, an unusual approach in terms of data, because I'm not sure in schools, certainly if you went back 10 or 15 years, that when we were using data or when we are using data, we're very often using data to look at things like attendance, but then we're looking at sort of student learning outcomes. I guess it's probably less common in schools for using data to look at well-being and stories. That does seem quite an unusual intersection. Would you say that's unusual, your approach?
Well, certainly back in the mid-2000s, when I was deputy head of a 3 to 16 school in London, and I was given the assessment, recording and reporting brief, the ARR responsibility. Data was very much about those cold abstractions. Yes, we might occasionally look at things like attendance, but essentially we were looking at that raw attainment data, which kids had pushed themselves over that threshold from the D to the C, and which kids were lagging behind that threshold. And data was all about how we could demonstrate to local and national government that we were achieving whatever arbitrary thresholds we had been set. So I think, yes, data has a history of, I think, either misuse or narrow usage, and has quite a bad rep. And I think that data needs to be reclaimed to a place of love. But I'll talk about that a bit more later as well.
Okay, so why then do schools need this approach, Matthew?
Well, because I think the school system incentivizes inauthenticity. Kids know that there are so many written and unwritten criteria through which they will be deemed either successful or of worth or worthy of affection and validation. And I also think the school system perpetuates problematic power dynamics and distribution. So we need to be intentional in challenging those things. And it's challenging those things that the Mona Lisa effect seeks to do. If we don't challenge that obsolete and problematic paradigm, then nothing will ever change. So that's why I think schools need this approach. We need to understand the actual human beings who form our school community, such that we can fashion and offer an experience that enables them to thrive.
So would you say that maybe one way of describing your work is bringing the humanity back into data analysis and data usage in schools?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. It is about humanity, and I think much of data use around the world is the opposite of that. It's inhumane. So absolutely, I think we need to bring the humanity into data usage, but we need to bring the humanity into schools, full stop. I think that there are so many risks of them becoming places of coldness and places of cruelty, places of unintended violence. And so, yes, let's bring the humanity into it. But data as we've understood it in schools is also a very narrow definition of what data has been seen as in the social sciences, for instance, where ethnographic data, mixed methods research, qualitative data have always played a really powerful role. So I don't think we're reinventing data here. I think we are actually unleashing the power of what data is always supposed to be.
Okay. And what is it not, the Mona Lisa effect?
Well, it's not about a particular data suite or a particular data platform. I describe my work these days as being platform agnostic, in that the principles and practices of the Mona Lisa effect would apply equally in an IB school, an American school, a British curriculum school, an early years setting, a university setting, anywhere around the world. It's also not training. I think that the power of context is so huge that what schools need is coaching, not training. And I know that you and the work your team are doing at your school would agree with that. It's not for me to come to a school and train them how to do things.
Mm.
I think that paradigm is one that professional learning and consultancy slips too easily into in the past. So I think it's not about training. And thirdly, data is not just about numbers, as I've alluded to earlier. I think that the Mona Lisa effect is fundamentally not about numbers, maybe about data, but for me, data is stories. Numbers can help us tell and read stories, but numbers are not the stories.
If I'm getting curious about the Mona Lisa effect now, listening to you talk, Matthew, and sounds like, this is going to help me bring more humanity to my school. It's going to be a starting point. It's going to help me understand the stories, perhaps, of my students more effectively. Okay, I've got lots of things I could be doing in my school, and the things I want to do in my school need to have a practical difference. So what would you say is one practical difference that I would notice in my school if we started to use the Mona Lisa effect? What might be different in a year or so's time?
Well, I think before I get on to answer that question, I think we need to unpick the question a little bit itself. I think we are so habituated in our desire for quick impact within education. We have been expected by our various overlords to deploy strategy A and see outcome B, right? We've been conned, I think, into believing that we inhabit some sort of ordered system whereby a specific input will guarantee a specific output. And that is not the case as long as you're dealing with human beings. Okay? If you're a child in my class and I introduce a new teaching and learning strategy to my work with you, that strategy won't guarantee any particular output, any particular outcome, because there are so many other intercontextual factors which are going to influence you as a student in my classroom. I think it's the same for a school. Having said that, consultancy is not cheap. Schools' budgets are increasingly strapped and stretched. So if I simply say, well, probably nothing will happen, Kai, then I'm not that likely to get you working with me. So what do I think you'll notice? I would hope that you'll notice change. I cannot predict the very nature of that change because one cannot predict emergence. Emergence happens as an organic consequence of all of the interactions and the interrelationality that I will explore with schools. But I can't predict what that change will be. I can say that I hope it will be change in the direction of equity, justice, and belonging. So I would hope that you are a more equitable and more just school where belonging is more universal. To use a metaphor from a friend of mine, Fiona Carter, who's Director of Academics with the Wellington group of schools, I hope that the heat lamp that we have over your community becomes bigger, that the kids and adults at the cold edges are fewer and further between. And I would hope that if we can establish equitable metrics, so data on a level playing field, ways of measuring kids that every child has a chance of succeeding within, that those metrics will improve. And to be honest with you, whilst I would never promise this, I think if we're doing all of those things, the academic outcomes are going to improve too anyway. It'll just be as an adjunct, as an inevitable consequence of doing everything else in a more humane, kinder, better way. The academics will go up too.
I mean, a big impact of your work on our school has been that we have two, I think, what in the olden days you'd have called them mottos. One of them is everyone can. And I think that's also embodied by your work, that you believe every child can and should achieve every day. ideally, and that's going to help support their well-being if they get that sense of achievement. If every child get that sense of achievement every day, that's something we should be aiming for. But actually, the motto which then comes before that for us is well-being first, which you might sense that might have been inspired by the work we've done with this, but we do use that alongside Everyone Can. So those are the two sort of foundational principles now of the work we do. So let's come back to your love of data, and you have used that word love at least once in the podcast so far. So you tell people, I think, that Matthew Savage loves data. Why do you love it?
I first fell in love with data as quantitative data, as numbers, as the sort of data that you and I have alluded to earlier on, right? And there is clarity for me and universality in number. I can't always understand people. Often I find them quite confusing, in fact. But numbers make sense to me, and they always have done. So I think I'm drawn to that clarity and that universality in a culturally complex world where different cultural contexts are forever misinterpreting each other. Numbers are numbers, right? I also love and seek patterns. I love finding patterns in the world, and I think data helps me to do that. And I also am intrigued by the power that data has, and this is good power and bad power, or power used for ill and power used for positive intent. And something that powerful has pulled me towards it in order for me to explore how to ensure that power is used for good and not for ill. But I also like the way that data challenges preconceptions. I don't like feeling comfortable. I like being taken out of my comfort zone, and data has a really powerful and effective way of doing that, be it qualitative and or quantitative data. I like the way that data and the stories it tells shines a spotlight into otherwise dark corners. And I'm also interested in the same way that one could argue that maths is a foundational principle which helps to explain physics, helps to explain chemistry, which helps to explain biology, which helps to explain geography, like you were referring to earlier. So do I think that data, in its broadest sense, helps us to understand the social sciences and helps us therefore to understand education, the pedagogy and practice and theory of it. So there are many, many reasons why I'm drawn to data, and those are just some of them.
Okay. And you mentioned 4 different types of data earlier. What are those 4 different types of data, Matthew?
Well, this is where a lot of my work is heading now. And I see this as a cycle, by the way. I think as I go through these, it brings you back to the first one and so on and so forth. And as with any effective cycle in education, it shouldn't just go constantly in one direction. We should sometimes recognize we need to go back a step in order then to be able to go forward a step again. But the 4 kinds of data are kind data, warm data, street data, and slow data. And I use these all with a lowercase letter at the start because warm and street data are specific concepts developed in the former case by Nora Bates and in the latter case by Sophia and Dugan's book. So my work is infused by those 3 people, but it's with a lowercase. It's gone in new and fresh directions. Kind data, this is all about avoiding data violence. Data so often is an instrument of violence in society at large, right? We know from books like Invisible Women or the wonderful Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill. We know that the data has been instrumentalized and exploited to further the division between groups in society, right? So kind data is about doing the opposite of that. using data to bring people together. It's about making sure that your data culture in the school is one of kindness. The way that you gather data from different stakeholders does so in a way that is kind to them. The data is not just about numbers, it's about those narratives, those stories that I talked about earlier. So kind data is that first step. How do I gather data in such a way that is kind to those who offer it to me, and in such a way that bestows kindness back on those very people? The warm data, for me, is all about context. Next year, I'm describing this as my work on tessellations, constellations, and fractal patterns, which essentially goes like this. If I know that you, Kai, in my class, got a lower score on your maths test this week than you got last week, I've got a piece of data, right? But that's incredibly cold. If I know that for the previous 5 weeks, your score was much higher, that's warmed that cold piece up a little bit. If I know that your physical health has been bad over the last few months because you had an accident in sports a few months ago, that's another piece of data which is going to warm that up. If I know that you've been having some friendship difficulties as you shift from one friendship group to another, that's going to warm that data up some more. If I know that you're learning a language other than your own and you're still not quite at a sufficiently advanced stage of your English language acquisition, that's going to warm that data up a little bit more. And I could go on ad infinitum with all these different data points that warm up the cold piece, giving it context. Now, if we do that also for groups of students and groups of staff, what the data becomes is what I would call an equity scanner. It finds our margins. And that brings us onto the third type of data, which is street data. And that's trying to listen to the stories from those margins, trying to tune in to those weak frequencies from the edges of visibility in our school, and to use those stories to review how equitable our organization actually is and what adaptations are necessary. As part of this, I conduct what I call a wellbeing equity review with lots of schools, with their students, with their educators and leaders, with their parents, where we adopt a UDL approach to trying to identify spikes and curb cuts. And we did a bit of that work with you in Muscat as well. And then the fourth type of data is slow. And this for me is an addition to my work over the last year. And I think this is critical. You alluded earlier to what effect or impact you might see from my work over a year of working with me. And I suggested that that question is rooted in an impatience amongst leaders that we see quick impact from the data that we collect. Whereas actually, sometimes I feel we need to slow down. We need to recognize that it's in the soil of the culture and climate of our school. It's in that soil that real sustainable change happens. But that soil takes time to dig into, to understand. So wherever possible, I would encourage that we're slow with our data, that we absorb it, we taste it, we till it, we nutrify it, such that the change we want is more long-lasting and is much bigger as a result. And once we do that, we're going to be brought back to wanting to collect more data, kindly. And so the whole thing becomes a cycle of kind, warm, street, and slow data. I hope that makes some sense.
Wow. That has just given me a completely different way of looking at and thinking about data. Is that your concept? Kind, warm, street, and slow?
Yeah, I've been infused, as I said, by Nora Bateson and Sophia and Dugan's work on warm and what they call warm and street data. But what they call warm and street data is also distinct from what it's become in my own work. But this idea of kind, warm, street, and slow data has evolved within my work independently over the last few years. And the great thing is about my job, why I'm so lucky to have it, is if you interviewed me in 2 years' time or 4 years' time or 6 years' time, you would see that that thinking has evolved because thinking should never stay still. So yeah, I'm proud of the work that I'm getting to do with schools in this area, but expect it to change in the future.
Absolutely. And I mean, we only had a conversation not so long ago, Matthew, and I thought I knew quite a lot about your work. And so you've just introduced me to a completely new data paradigm there. I mean, I really struggled when I was in the UK, and I was in the UK education state system for 24 years, and I struggled to see myself as a school leader in a UK school, partly because what you were saying earlier about how data was being used in schools in the noughties. And if somebody had introduced me to the concept that you just have, and talked about data being kind, warm, street, and slow, that gives a completely different meaning and feeling and use and impact, I think, of how we can use data in schools. How would you win over those listeners who are still maybe a little bit scared about data in their school?
Well, firstly, I think it's not just a small number of listeners who are a little bit scared. I think it's probably a large number of listeners who are a lot scared, right? And why wouldn't they be? Their past experience, my past experience, uh, would certainly support my being scared of data. Data's been a stick with which I've been beaten. Even in the international school sector today, we've got a lot of schools who purport to put wellbeing first, like you've mentioned earlier. But come September, they'll be broadcasting their IB and A-level results in terms of who got the straight A stars or the 45s, who's getting into Ivy League and Russell Group universities. And again, then it becomes about performative data and cold data. So yeah, people are right to be cynical. Of course they are. Inspectorates, boards, leadership teams need to shift in order for educators, students, and parents to feel safe within a new data paradigm. Because if the inspectorates and the boards and the leadership team who answer to those different entities are scared of doing data differently, then everyone else is going to remain scared of the old paradigm, right? So for me, I think it does lie in storytelling. None of us are scared of stories. In fact, we've all loved stories from before our very earliest memories. We've all, as very young children, even before we had words ourselves, we've all loved a story being told to us. It's something primal in that. Some of the earliest evidence and artifacts from ancient peoples show that stories have been central to our existence, to our meaning. And I think if we can demonstrate that that's what data is, it's about stories. And all of the data about me is helping you to read my story. Then I don't think it becomes so scary because we all like listening to stories. We all enjoy that experience of story sharing. And what I also remind educators who are scared of data is that data is never a fact. It's purely a flag telling us that we might want to have a dig around underneath it. And you know what? We might find something cool or we might not. It's never an answer. In fact, if we go to the data expecting answers, we go to the data with our own bias, and therefore the answers, surprise, surprise, will be biased too. Data should be asking us questions, challenging, uncomfortable questions about our practice, about our culture and climate in the school. And data should not be a label, but it should be a signpost. It should offer us different directions from which to approach different children or adults in our school. So I think if you talk about it as flags, questions, and signposts, you talk about it as stories, and you don't just talk about it in those terms, you follow through with your own leadership practices and governance practices in the school, then I think that people are remarkably easy to win round. It's when there are mixed messages, when you talk about it but don't do it, then you're never really going to win people around.
I just love the way you've talked about data there, Matthew, because I think I've thought for a long time that yes, I've been scared of data, but the one of the things I do like about data is how it can be the start of a conversation, or like you said, the start of a story, or the provocation into a discussion. And that's what I really enjoyed when, when we've been sitting around in a meeting, either with with teachers or with school leaders or with governors or with parents, and the data has sparked really interesting, provocative, deep conversations, and that for me has been, the power of data. I feel I'm now in a masterclass of a new data paradigm with you here, Matthew, this podcast. It's really, really getting me excited, getting me thinking about all sorts of things. And you've talked about, this is an evolving process. That's one of the things I also really like about your work. You haven't sort of come up with one idea and then it's a very, very fixed. You're evolving your work. So I guess the other dimension I'm curious to explore this afternoon, then if we try and maybe zoom out a bit and think about how this work fits into, the big picture. We're hearing, I think, a lot in the media, in the traditional media, social media, conversations that we're having in our schools and our communities. We're hearing a lot about mental health, a global well-being crisis amongst young people, maybe amongst grown-ups too. How does your work, do you feel, fit into the global conversation and the global concern? Are we in a mental health crisis? How does this work feed into that? How does it fit into the big picture, Matthew?
I think we're in the midst of a meta crisis, to be honest with you. The crisis that we inhabit, that we experience when we wake up each morning, is incredibly complex. And it comes from so many different places and spaces. And we need change. Within schools, we need change. Attendance statistics are plummeting in the Western world. Mental health amongst children and adults is plummeting. Curriculum and pedagogy lag significantly behind societal progress and fail to prepare us for the existential challenges that are facing us worldwide. So we fundamentally need change. And in terms of there being a well-being crisis, absolutely there is. I mean, the data seems incontrovertible to me. Although there'll always be a cultural dimension to well-being, I am convinced that there is a global well-being crisis amongst young people and indeed amongst adults. And it's hard to see why there wouldn't be. If I'm a teenager today and I wake up and I'm reminded of the world I live in, a world of climate emergency, a world of increased marginalization and culture wars and a widening of the gap between those who have and those who don't, those who are powerful, those who have no power, a world in which war is more insidious and more destructive than ever before, a world still wrestling with the consequences of one pandemic, probably with another just around the corner, a world where technology threatens to do as much damage as it does good. I mean, how could I not struggle within that? Especially when a lot of that is stuff that's being handed to me by the adult world. Like, here's the world we've created, right now, deal with it. It's hard to see why I wouldn't be struggling. But I don't think we're necessarily equipping children and young people to deal with that, to respond to that in a way that enables them to preserve their well-being moving forward. So in terms of big picture, if we need change, change happens in the soil. The best gardeners or farmers are not experts in plants, they're experts in soil. Some even taste the soil in order to work out whether it is optimized for the crops that they need to grow within it. And so if you follow that analogy forward, societal change, institutional change need to happen in the soil of our culture and our climate. But if we are to seed change in the soil of our culture and our climate, we need to understand that culture and that climate, which is where the data comes in, right? We need to understand that everything is interrelated, which is why it needs to be worn. We need to understand that schools and education are an ecosystem. And then, only then, do we stand any chance of assisting change, of creating the conditions through which for positive change to emerge. So I think it's all about the big picture. And I also think within a school, I think educators have for too long been chasing those plants and those flowers, right? We see a metaphorical plant or flower blossoming, then we celebrate it and we praise it. We see one that's withering, we rush over to sort it out. We're constantly chasing those emergent states, and it's exhausting. It's draining for educators and for leaders. What if we did adopt a more slow data approach? What if we did step back? What if we did invest our energy in understanding the soil of our culture and climate so that we can create the conditions for sustainable, long-lasting, inclusive, and positive change? We'd be less exhausted because we wouldn't be playing whack-a-mole the whole time, having to knock these things back into their hole. So it's all about the big picture. And I think that's how it fits in. I'm not advocating any of the practices that I explore with schools because they will tinker. I'm advocating them because they will feed upheaval, transformation. We just don't quite know how that will happen.
If I've got this masterclass, if I'm still on the right track with you, Matthew, is it then correct say that, well, to understand the soil, we need to look at the data around that soil, and we need to look at that data through the paradigm of kind data, warm data, street data, and slow data? That's how
Precisely.
we need to analyze the soil.
Absolutely. If we adopt that cycle of kind, warm, street, and slow, we will better and better understand our soil. We'll better and better understand the toxins that exist within it that we need to find a way of cleaning out. We'll better understand the ways in which it needs to be nutrified, the nutrients that exist and the nutrients which are lacking. And we'll better understand what we can do about it. Because without there being kind of a what next, a so what now what, it's all just ideas, it's all philosophy, it's all very interesting, but if it's not going to play any role in making things better, then there's too much urgency around the problems that surround us for us just to engage in esoteric debate. But I think it is about doing something. And I think in schools, the founding principle you talked about there that we had explored when I last worked with you, the idea of putting well-being first. I think that is a core and foundational principle that we need to espouse and we need to stick to. We need to root our decisions in kindness, because if we're really putting well-being first, we are thinking about well-being before we think about anything else. As a leader, I had to make decisions all the time, hundreds of decisions every single day. And one of the mantras I tried increasingly to remind myself of was that the right thing is the right thing. And that might seem tautological or just nonsensical. But when I actually sat in that space, I realized that the kind thing is the kind thing. And often it wasn't that unclear to me what the kind thing was to do. So we need to root our decisions in kindness. We need to practice unconditional love. I talk a lot about this in my work. There are so many conditions and contingencies and criteria in schools that will determine whether or not the human beings in our school can belong. So I think we need to show that we, as an institution, love the members of our community unconditionally, because after all, that's what love is, right? We need to identify the well-being margins, because that's where the most urgent work is needed in schools. And then we need to increase our support capacity to deal with the well-being needs that we will have unearthed. And that's, just as critical a piece of the process. But yeah, to go back to your original question about the big picture, it is all about the big picture. It's all about instrumentalizing that cycle of the 4 different types of data to understand our soil and to detoxify and nutrify it such that the positive emergence of the future will be so much better and more beautiful than that of the past.
This conversation, Matthew, has been a tonic, or I found it actually incredibly therapeutic. So I don't know what listeners are thinking out there, but just helping me, and I hope listeners out across the world thinking of data in a different way can, I think, like you're hoping, help us think about how we can do things differently in our schools for the better of our young people and for also the communities we work with. So it's been deep, and it's got deeper and deeper as we've got along, which is great. I love a deep conversation, and I love it when I'm working with visionary educators like yourself, Matthew, who are then helping us think in a different way, which will be for the better of our communities. So we're going to now maybe lighten the mood a little bit, and we're going to what we call the quick fire round, or I did rename it recently, the bottom lining round. Bottom lining means keeping to the very essence of a response. So one word is fine, one sentence maximum. That's what we're looking for with these questions. So the bottom lining or the quick fire round, few questions just to lighten the mood a little bit, and just to finish off this wonderful conversation. So here we go, Matthew. Are you ready for the bottom lining round?
Well, I'll give it my best shot. Conciseness is not one of my best known traits, but I will give it my best shot.
Here's an opportunity for you to practice conciseness. So the biggest leadership lesson that you keep on having to learn, Matthew, is what?
The problem is not the problem. You'd alluded to problems a moment ago, and the problems in your intro. I guarantee you that if you think about them kindly, warmly, streetly, and slowly, you'll realize that the problem was not the problem in the first place. It was something totally different.
Thank you. A key moment in your leadership journey that made you think or lead differently.
When I moved internationally, because I learned then you cannot transplant things that work within one context to another. There's a brilliant Alicia Ferrero book, Context Changes Everything, and I really think it does.
The soil's a bit different as you move
Absolutely.
around the world. And you're not the first person I've heard say that the move to international made you think differently. Your favorite way to unwind at the end of a busy day as a consultant?
Yeah, this one's tricky. I'm not very good at this one yet. Often at the end of a day, for me, it's more recovery than unwinding. I battle with quite complex disability and physical and mental ill health, so it's recovery, but it's music, film, family, pets, nature, as much of a blend of those things as I can possibly achieve.
And finally, leadership is
creating enabling constraints and psychological safety so that the middle leaders and below can do the leading.
Okay, now I said that was the final question. That was a trick by me, or a mistake. My final question is this. The purpose of education, Matthew, should be what, in your opinion?
To help kids to see the world interrelationally and to help them to practice unconditional love.
Amazing. Well, that brings us pretty much to the end of the podcast. I actually have got even one question for you, Matthew. Have you come across the book Slow by Carl Honore?
Yes, I have. It's on my bookshelf.
Yeah, so I don't think he's got slow data in there, but I might be wrong. Maybe you've just added a new chapter to the second edition of Carl Honore's book on slow. But if listeners are out there, you're interested in slow data, or you're interested in slow things in general, I could highly recommend Carl Honore's book, Slow, The Power of Slow, I think he calls it.
Nora Bateson, whom I've referred earlier, said to me recently, "We don't have the time to be in a hurry."
And maybe I should just end it with a very short story, which you make me think about this in this podcast, Matthew. Is I remember talking to a head teacher quite a few years ago at this time of the year. We were getting towards the end of the school year and everything was happening all at once, he felt, in his school. And it just got too much for this head teacher. And he resigned, so pretty much in the moment. And then I saw him a few months later, and he was so sad that in that moment he had resigned. He really regretted that decision. And I guess maybe if he'd have been a bit more slow in his decision making and, looked at the warm and the kind and the street data and thought about that slowly and just taken a few more moments, he might not have made such a hasty and impactful decision on his own career and his school at that time. So if you're out there and you're feeling a bit down at the moment, or it's all getting a bit too much, take time. Never make a decision in haste unless you really have to. And think about data in this new paradigm. Matthew, it's been an absolute joy and inspiration, mind-bending conversation this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And thank you so much for the incredible work you are doing with schools, staff, colleagues, and young people all over the world. It is quite an inspiration.
It's my absolute pleasure, Kai. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care and enjoy the seeding period.
I will do. Goodbye.
Take care. Thank you. You've been listening to the Educator's Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world, the podcast where we stay curious for just a little bit longer. The Educator's Corner podcast is hosted by me, Kai Vasher, and produced by Stuart Pardo, Zoe Snell, and Marion James, and by BSM BSS Productions.